I found out I had been erased from my family's future on a Tuesday morning 5 days before Christmas while standing in line at a grocery store with a cart full of things I was still expected to bring. The cashier was chatting about holiday traffic when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. I wish I had. The message wasn't long. It didn't need to be. "Hi, Miss Carter. This is Michael Lewis from Anderson & Klein Law Group. I'm calling to confirm you received notice regarding the updated will and inheritance allocations finalized last week." Updated will. Inheritance allocations. Finalized. I stood there gripping the cart handle while the woman behind me cleared her throat, annoyed that I wasn't moving. The beeping of the scanner felt too loud, too sharp, like it was marking time I no longer belonged to. "I'm sorry," I said, automatically pushing the cart forward, my mind already racing. "My name is Rebecca Carter. I'm 32 years old. And until that voicemail, I believed I was still considered a daughter in my own family. I paid without remembering the total. I walked to my car in a daze, the cold air biting through my coat, and sat behind the wheel with the engine off. I played the voicemail again. He sounded calm, professional, certain. That certainty terrified me. My parents had always framed money as something we didn't discuss. Not because we didn't have it, but because, as my mother liked to say, talking about it brings out the worst in people. What she really meant was control worked better when information stayed vague. I called the number back. Voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I sat there and replayed the last year in my head looking for signs. Missed birthdays, family meetings I wasn't invited to, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. My younger brother Daniel had always been the center of gravity, the one my parents worried about, invested in, protected. I was the stable one, the responsible one, the one who didn't need help. Or so they told me. I drove straight to my parents' house. They lived in a large, 2-story place outside of Columbus, the kind of home that looked warm and welcoming from the outside. White trim, wreaths on the windows, a perfect Christmas card backdrop. My mother answered the door with a surprised smile. "Rebecca, you didn't call." "I need to talk to you," I said. Her smile faltered for half a second before she stepped aside. My father was in his office, the door open just enough for me to see papers spread across his desk. Legal-looking papers. He didn't look up when I entered. "Dad," I said. He sighed and finally met my eyes. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." There it was. Not denial, not confusion. Confirmation. "What did you change?" I asked. My mother moved closer, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We made adjustments," she said, "for the sake of fairness." Fairness. The word landed wrong. "You removed me from the will," I said flatly. My father looked away. "We didn't remove you," my mother said quickly. "We restructured." To what I asked. 0. Daniel's name came up immediately. Family business shares, future control, trust protections. I was mentioned once. A contingency. Something that applied only if others failed. I listened quietly while something inside me hardened. They talked about responsibility, about how Daniel needed support, about how I was doing well and didn't need inheritance to define my future. They never once asked how it felt. When they finished, the room felt colder. "So this was decided without me," I said. My father nodded. "It was simpler that way." I smiled then, slowly. "Okay," I said. "Then I'll make my decisions the same way." My mother frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, picking up my coat, "you just taught me exactly how this family works." I left before they could answer. As I drove away, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from Daniel. "Hey, Mom said you're upset. Let's talk after Christmas." After Christmas. After everything was finalized. I didn't reply. I had spent my entire life being the reasonable one. They had just mistaken that for powerless. And that mistake was going to cost them more than money. I didn't cry on the drive home. That surprised me more than anything else. For most of my life, I had been trained to respond to disappointment quietly internally, the way a well-adjusted daughter was supposed to. Swallow it. Rationalize it. Move on. But as I merged onto the highway, hands steady on the wheel, what I felt wasn't sadness. It was clarity. They hadn't forgotten me. They hadn't overlooked me. They had calculated me. And once you realize you've been calculated, emotion becomes a luxury you can't afford. When I got back to my apartment, I set the grocery bags on the counter and unpacked them slowly, deliberately. I needed normal motion, something grounded. Milk in the fridge, bread in the cabinet, cranberry sauce I'd been asked to bring to Christmas dinner, now sitting there like a prop from a play I no longer belonged to. I stared at it for a long moment, then put it back in the bag. My phone buzzed again. "Daniel." I let it ring. Daniel had always been good at timing. Not intentionally cruel, just instinctively centered. If there was a crisis, it bent around him. If there was limited support, it flowed toward him. And if there was conflict, someone else absorbed it, so he didn't have to. Usually me. I poured a glass of water and finally checked the voicemail from the lawyer again, listening past the words to the assumptions underneath them. He hadn't asked if I knew. He had assumed I did, which meant the paperwork was already filed. I opened my laptop and searched Anderson & Klein Law Group. Estate planning, trust administration, family business succession. That last phrase made my chest tighten. Family business. My parents had always spoken about it vaguely. Investments, holdings, things your father manages. I'd never pushed. That was the unspoken rule. Asking questions implied need. Need implied weakness. Daniel worked there now. Had for the last 2 years. I hadn't. At 7:15, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I answered. "Rebecca," she said, voice carefully warm. "I wish you hadn't left so abruptly." "I wish I hadn't been excluded so thoroughly," I replied. A pause. "You're taking this personally," she said. I almost laughed. "You changed your will without telling me," I said. "How else am I supposed to take it?" "It wasn't meant as punishment," she replied quickly. "It was about stability." For whom I asked. "For the family," she said, as if that explained everything. "Which family?" I asked. She sighed. "You know Daniel is under a lot of pressure." "I know Daniel is 30, I replied, "and employed by you." "That's not fair," she snapped. "Neither is contingency status," I said calmly. Silence stretched between us. "We didn't think you'd react like this," she said finally. That sentence landed harder than anything else. "You didn't think I'd react at all," I said. She didn't deny it. "We can talk after the holidays," she said, softening again. "This isn't the right time." I closed my eyes. "It was the right time before you signed papers," I said. "Now it's just inconvenient." When I hung up, my hands were shaking slightly, not from anger, from restraint. That night, I barely slept. Not because my thoughts were racing, but because they were lining up, one after another, patterns forming, gaps revealing themselves. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Then I did something my parents never expected. I called a lawyer of my own. Her name was Elaine Porter, mid-50s. Estate litigation, family asset, disputes, business trusts. Her assistant tried to schedule me 2 weeks out. "This is time-sensitive," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I stated a fact. I was in her office by noon. Elaine listened without interrupting, pen-still eyes focused. I showed her the voicemail transcript. I repeated my parents' language exactly as they'd used it. Restructured, fairness, stability. When I finished, she leaned back. "They didn't just adjust a will," she said. "They repositioned power." "That's what it felt like," I replied. "Do you know what assets are involved?" she asked. "No," I said, "but my brother works for them now." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "That's relevant." She explained the basics calmly. Trusts, amendments, fiduciary obligations, the difference between exclusion and subordination. "You weren't disinherited," she said. "You were sidelined." That word hit something deep. "What can I do?" I asked. She studied me. "First, don't confront them again. Second, don't sign anything. Third, we get information." How? I asked. "We start with disclosure," she said, "and we prepare for resistance." When I left her office, the air felt colder, sharper, like the world had shifted into focus. That afternoon, Daniel finally texted, "Can we meet just us?" I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to protect him, to explain gently, to give him the benefit of the doubt I'd been trained to give everyone else. Another part of me remembered the office door, the legal papers, the silence. "Yes," I typed, "tomorrow." We met at a cafe halfway between our places. He looked nervous, guilty, defensive, all at once. "I didn't know they hadn't told you," he said immediately. "That's interesting," I replied, "because your name is everywhere in the restructuring." He blinked. "What?" "You work there," I said. "You had to know something." He looked away. "They said it was temporary." Temporary. The word again. "Did you benefit?" I asked. He hesitated. That was my answer. "They said you'd understand," he said quietly, "that you didn't need it." I leaned back in my chair. "That's the difference between us," I said. "You thought my silence meant agreement." He swallowed. "What are you going to do?" I met his eyes. "I'm going to find out what you didn't tell me," I said, "and then I'm going to decide who I want to be related to." His phone buzzed on the table. "Mom." He didn't answer. As I stood to leave, I felt something settle in my chest. Not vengeance, not bitterness. Resolve. They had built a system assuming I would adapt. They were about to learn what happens when the wrong person stops accommodating. And they still had no idea what I had just started uncovering. The first document arrived by certified mail 2 days later, disguised as something ordinary. A holiday card. White envelope. My parents' handwriting. A return address that made it look personal, almost affectionate. I didn't open it right away. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of paper that wasn't meant to carry love. Inside was not a card. It was a formal notice. Dear Rebecca. It began typed impersonal. This letter serves as official acknowledgement that recent estate planning updates were executed in accordance with applicable law. No action is required from you at this time. No action required. That sentence was doing a lot of work. Attached was a summary page, not the will itself, not the trust documents, just enough to establish that something existed and that I was expected to accept it without review. I scanned the language carefully. Phrases like reallocation of managerial authority, family continuity, and protective oversight appeared repeatedly. My name appeared once buried in a clause labeled secondary beneficiary under limited conditions. Elaine had warned me about this. Subordination disguised as inclusion. I didn't call my parents. I didn't text Daniel. I forwarded everything to Elaine with a single line. This just arrived. Her reply came within an hour. They're positioning. Now we push for disclosure. That afternoon, Elaine sent a formal request to Anderson and Klein Law Group. Polite, precise, unignorable. Request for full copies of all trust instruments amendments and asset schedules in which Rebecca Carter is named directly or indirectly as a beneficiary or contingent party. No accusations, no threats, just law. I spent the rest of the day doing something my family had never expected from me. I remembered conversations I'd dismissed. My mother talking about cleaning things up after my grandmother passed. My father joking about how paperwork mattered more than people. Daniel mentioning late nights at the office, saying he was learning the ropes. Ropes around what exactly? That evening, Daniel called. I got a weird email from the lawyers, he said. I know, I replied. You hired someone, he said, not quite accusing, not quite surprised. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Mom's upset. I'm aware, I said. She says you're escalating, he added. I almost smiled. They escalated when they signed without me, I replied. They're saying it's standard, he said, that this is how families protect businesses. Families who don't trust each other, I said. He sighed. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I replied. I'm making it visible. Silence again. Do you even know what you're asking for? He asked. That's exactly the problem, I said. I don't. The call ended without resolution. The next morning, Elaine called me before 9. They responded, she said. My stomach tightened, and they sent partials, she replied, which means they're hiding the rest. She explained quickly. I listened, taking notes. The trust had been amended 3 times in the last 18 months. Each amendment increased Daniel's authority. Each one reduced independent oversight. And one amendment coincided exactly with the month I had been out of state for work. You were physically unavailable, Elaine said, which made exclusion easier. I closed my eyes. They also attached an asset schedule, she continued. Not complete, but enough. Enough for what I asked. To see the shape of the lie, she replied. I drove to her office an hour later. We spread the documents across the table, corporate names I didn't recognize, holding companies nested inside other holding companies. A family business that wasn't one business at all, but a network. Real estate, logistics, private lending, and one line item that made Elaine go very still. This, she said, tapping the page, was your grandmother's. My chest tightened. My grandmother had always said something would come to me, not as a promise, as an assumption. She used to joke that I was the only one who read fine print. The asset was a minority stake, quiet, valuable, and now fully absorbed into a trust controlled by my parents and administered by my brother. They couldn't do this if she specified you, Elaine said slowly. She did, I replied. I saw it years ago. Elaine looked at me sharply. You saw the will? Yes, I said before she died. That changed everything. Rebecca, Elaine said carefully, if what you're saying is accurate, this isn't just family drama. What is it, I asked? It's misrepresentation, she said, possibly breach of fiduciary duty. The words landed heavy. That night, I went home and dug through an old box I hadn't opened in years. Letters, photos, a copy of my grandmother's handwriting on yellowed paper. And there it was. A note. Not a formal will, but a letter of intent, clear, specific, naming me. I sat on the floor holding it, heart pounding, not with grief, but with understanding. They hadn't just restructured. They had overridden her. The next morning, Elaine sent a second letter, this one sharper. Request for documentation regarding the disposition of assets originating from Margaret Carter's estate, including any instruments overriding previously stated intent. By noon, my phone started buzzing. Mom, Dad, Daniel. I ignored them all. At 3:15, Anderson and Klein responded. Short, careful, defensive. They claimed the matter had been interpreted within discretionary authority. Elaine read it once, then looked at me. They're nervous, she said. For the first time I asked, yes, she replied, because now this isn't about feelings. It was about proof. That evening, Daniel showed up at my apartment unannounced. He looked shaken. "They're saying you're accusing them of something serious," he said. "I'm asking for documents," I replied. "If there's nothing wrong, they'll hold." He ran a hand through his hair. "You don't understand what this could do." I met his eyes. "You don't understand what they already did." He hesitated. "If this goes further—" "It will," I said quietly. "Because the moment that they touched my grandmother's intent, they stopped being a family protecting itself. They became people hiding behind it. And I was no longer willing to be quiet for their comfort. The pressure didn't come all at once. It came in waves, carefully timed, each one designed to test whether I would flinch. The first wave was emotional. My mother left a voicemail just after 8 in the morning, her voice softer than it had been in days, almost fragile. "Rebecca, this has gone too far. Your father hasn't been sleeping. Daniel is under tremendous stress. I don't understand why you're doing this to us." Not why I was asking questions. Why I was doing this to them. I deleted the message without responding. Elaine had warned me this would happen. When people lose control of a narrative, they reach for guilt because it's cheaper than truth. The second wave arrived before lunch. An email from my father. Subject: family matters. He wrote about legacy, about sacrifice, about how families sometimes had to make difficult decisions for the greater good. He reminded me of everything they had provided: education, stability, opportunity. He did not mention my grandmother. He did not mention the letter. He did not mention the missing asset. That omission told me everything. The third wave was Daniel. He called repeatedly, then showed up at my office building just before 5, pacing in the lobby, like a man who had finally realized he might be standing on the wrong side of something irreversible. "You need to stop this," he said the moment we were alone. I studied him carefully. His suit was wrinkled. His confidence was thinner than I had ever seen it. Why, I asked. "Because it's not what you think," he said quickly. "They didn't steal anything." "Then they should be eager to prove it," I replied. "You're tearing the family apart," he said. "No," I said calmly. "I'm refusing to hold it together with silence." He looked at me like he wanted to say more but didn't know how. "They told me you'd calm down," he admitted, "that you always do." That one sentence did more damage than anything else he'd said. I nodded slowly. "Now you know why this scares them." That night, Elaine called. "They made a mistake," she said. My pulse quickened. "What kind?" "They responded to the second request," she said, "but they included something they didn't intend to." She emailed me the file while we were still on the phone. A ledger, not a full accounting, just an internal summary. Dates, transfers, asset movement codes that looked meaningless unless you knew what to look for. Elaine knew. "Your grandmother's stake," she said, "was moved into a holding company 3 months before her death." My throat tightened. "Without her consent?" "Yes," Elaine replied, "under a power of attorney executed shortly before she passed." I closed my eyes. My grandmother had been lucid until the very end. Sharp, suspicious of paperwork she didn't initiate. "That power of attorney," Elaine continued, "names your father." Something inside me went very still. "They used it to consolidate assets," she said, "then folded everything into the trust." "Which Daniel now administers," I said. "Yes," Elaine replied, "which creates a very uncomfortable timeline." I felt a surge of something cold and focused settle in my chest. "This isn't just unfair," I said. "It's calculated." "And risky," Elaine added, "if challenged." "Then we challenge it," I said. Elaine was quiet for a moment. "Then are you prepared for what that means?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation, because now I understood the real reason they had sidelined me. They weren't protecting Daniel. They were protecting themselves. The next morning, Elaine filed a formal notice of contest. Not dramatic, not accusatory, precise. Challenge to fiduciary conduct and asset reallocation under disputed authority. Within an hour, my phone exploded. My father. My mother. Daniel. An unfamiliar number I recognized as Anderson and Klein. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I went to work, sat at my desk, and focused on the one thing they could no longer control: facts. By noon, Elaine forwarded me an email from the firm representing my parents. They wanted a meeting. Not a casual one. Not after the holidays. Immediately. "They're scared," Elaine said. "This ledger shouldn't have left their office." "Good," I replied. "They'll try to reframe," she warned. "Offer concessions. Appeal to family harmony." "I'm not negotiating harmony," I said. "I'm establishing truth." That afternoon, Daniel sent one last message. "If this goes to court, everything changes." I stared at it for a long time before replying. "Everything already did. You just didn't notice when it happened." When I set my phone down, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Leverage. They had assumed my role was to absorb shock. They hadn't planned for the moment I stopped cushioning the impact. And now the structure they'd built on that assumption was starting to crack. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at 10, held in a glass-walled conference room at Anderson and Klein Law Group. Neutral ground, controlled temperature, polished wood table that reflected everyone's face just enough to remind you that you were being watched. Elaine arrived early, calm, prepared. She placed a single folder in front of her and nothing else. That alone unsettled them. My parents arrived together. My father looked older than I remembered, not fragile but diminished, like a man who had spent too long believing authority was permanent. My mother's posture was rigid, her expression fixed in a practiced version of concern that used to fool me. Daniel came last. He avoided my eyes. Across the table sat two attorneys from Anderson and Klein, both careful, both alert. They opened with pleasantries that felt insultingly thin. This meeting, one of them began, is intended to resolve misunderstandings before they escalate unnecessarily. Elaine didn't respond. I didn't either. The silence stretched just long enough to force them to continue without control. My father cleared his throat. "Rebecca, we never intended to hurt you." "I know," I replied. "You intended to proceed." My mother leaned forward. "You're framing this in the worst possible way." "No," I said evenly. "I'm framing it accurately." One of the attorneys interjected. "Perhaps we should clarify the purpose of the trust amendments." "Please do," Elaine said calmly. They explained it the way I'd expected. Market volatility, succession planning, risk mitigation. They spoke as if reciting something memorized, careful not to acknowledge the ledger, the power of attorney, or my grandmother's letter. When they finished, Elaine opened her folder. "Before we discuss intent," she said, "we need to address authority." She slid a single document across the table. The room shifted. "This," she continued, "is a copy of a letter written by Margaret Carter, expressing clear intent regarding the disposition of her minority stake." My mother inhaled sharply. My father's face drained of color. Daniel stared at the table. Elaine's voice remained steady. "We also have evidence that this asset was transferred under a power of attorney executed shortly before Ms. Carter's death." One of the attorneys leaned forward. "That power of attorney was valid." "That's not the issue," Elaine replied. "The issue is whether it was used in good faith." Silence. I watched my parents carefully, not for guilt, for calculation. My father spoke first. "We were acting in the family's best interest." Elaine nodded. "Then you'll have no objection to full disclosure." The attorney hesitated. "That may not be necessary." "It is," Elaine said, "given the timeline." My mother finally spoke. "Rebecca, this isn't about your grandmother. This is about stability." I turned to her. "Then why did you move her asset before she died?" Her mouth opened, then closed. Daniel looked up. "Dad." My father's voice was tight. It was cleaner that way. "Cleaner." That word snapped something inside me. "You erased her intent because it was inconvenient," I said quietly. "That's not fair," my mother said sharply. "It's exact," I replied. Elaine slid another page forward. "This ledger," she said, "indicates consolidation of assets to limit independent claims." The attorney stiffened. "That document was not intended for distribution." "That," Elaine said, "is your problem." The meeting derailed quickly after that. They offered compromises, increased percentages, revisions, quiet settlements, all of it framed around money. Elaine listened, then turned to me. "Do you wish to respond?" I looked around the table. At my parents, at my brother, at the structure they had built assuming I would negotiate my dignity. "No," I said. Everyone froze. "I'm not here to renegotiate my value," I continued. "I'm here to correct the record." One of the attorneys frowned. "Then what are you seeking?" I met his eyes. Accountability. Daniel finally spoke, voice unsteady. "This could destroy everything." I looked at him gently. "It already has. You just benefited from the delay." My mother stood abruptly. "You're being vindictive." I shook my head. "I'm being honest." Elaine closed her folder. "We will proceed with formal discovery," she said. "All communications, all amendments, all financial movements tied to the trust." The attorneys exchanged a look. "This will get ugly," one of them warned. Elaine smiled slightly. Truth often does. As we stood to leave, my father reached for my arm. "Rebecca," he said quietly, desperation creeping in. "Think about what you're doing." I stepped back. "I am," I said, for the first time. We walked out together, Elaine and I, the glass doors closing behind us. In the hallway, she finally exhaled. "They're exposed," she said. "Good," I replied, because somewhere between that ledger and that meeting, I had understood the real betrayal. They hadn't just excluded me from inheritance. They had excluded me from truth, and that was the one thing I would not forgive. The backlash didn't come through the courts. It came through people. By Sunday afternoon, my phone had become a quiet map of loyalty. Names lit up that I hadn't heard from in years. Aunts, cousins, family friends who used to hug me at holidays and now spoke with the careful tone of people who had already chosen a side. "Your parents are heartbroken. This is tearing the family apart. You don't understand how these things work. Money changes people." I read every message. I replied to none. Elaine had warned me this would happen too. When legal leverage stalls, social pressure takes over. It's cheaper, faster, and leaves fewer fingerprints. My mother's sister called first. "Rebecca, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with concern. "Your parents are beside themselves. Why are you doing this publicly?" "I haven't spoken publicly," I replied. "Well, people are talking," she said. "It's embarrassing." That word again. "Then maybe they should have thought about that before they rewrote history," I said. She sighed. "You were always so sensitive." I ended the call. By Monday morning, I had been quietly uninvited from Christmas dinner. Daniel texted, "Mom thinks space is best right now." I stared at the message longer than I should have. Space had never been my choice. It had always been assigned to me. That afternoon, Elaine forwarded me something that changed the temperature of the room entirely. "They filed a response," she wrote, "and they overplayed." Attached was a formal statement submitted by my parents' attorneys, framing me as emotionally reactive, estranged, and uninvolved in family operations. They emphasized Daniel's hands-on role and my lack of contribution to justify the restructuring. Elaine's note beneath it was short. "They made you small on paper. That's dangerous for them." Why, I asked when she called. "Because they've established a narrative," she said. "And narratives collapse when facts contradict them." "What facts?" I asked. She paused. "Do you remember what you did for the company before Daniel ever worked there?" I frowned. "I help Dad review contracts sometimes, logistics agreements, vendor disputes." "How often?" she pressed. "Regularly," I said slowly. "For years." "And did you bill them?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I thought I was just helping." Elaine inhaled sharply. "Rebecca," she said, "you weren't uninvolved. You were unpaid." The realization hit me like cold water. I had reviewed contracts that were still active. I had flagged risks. I had suggested structural changes. And my name appeared on none of it. "Why does that matter now?" I asked. "Because they just claimed you had no role," Elaine said, "and I think you can prove otherwise." That night I went through old emails, not emotionally, methodically. There they were, threads with my father, attachments with my comments, tracked changes on agreements that later became core to the business. I hadn't noticed before because I hadn't needed credit. Now I needed accuracy. At 11:30 I sent everything to Elaine. Her response came an hour later. "This changes leverage. They're not just exposed, they're afraid." The next morning my father called. Not my mother, not Daniel. "Him, Rebecca," he said quietly. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," I replied. "This has gone too far," he said. "Your mother is taking it hard." "You should have thought about that before you used Grandma's power of attorney," I replied. Silence. Then carefully, "What did you want?" The question surprised me. "I want the truth documented," I said, "and I want my name removed from any narrative that makes me disposable." "That could damage the company," he said. "It already did," I replied. "You just hid it behind my silence." He exhaled. "Daniel is worried." "That's new," I said. "Rebecca," he said, voice tightening, "if this goes further, it won't just affect inheritance." "I know," I said. "It will affect credibility." Another pause. "You always were good with details," he said softly. That was the closest thing to an admission I was going to get. When I hung up, I felt something settle. They weren't afraid of losing money. They were afraid of losing legitimacy. That afternoon, Elaine filed a supplemental notice. Evidence of material contribution and mischaracterization of involvement. Clean, precise, devastating. Within hours, Anderson and Klein requested a continuance. Delay. The oldest signal of weakness. Daniel showed up at my apartment that evening, eyes red, jaw tight. "They're saying you're trying to take everything," he said. I shook my head. "I'm trying to stop being erased." He slumped onto the couch. "I didn't know they'd go this far." "You knew enough," I said gently. He looked up. "If they fall?" I met his eyes, "Then they fall. Not out of revenge, out of gravity." As he left, I realized something important. The thing they feared most wasn't court. It wasn't exposure. It wasn't even money. It was the possibility that I would no longer protect them by being reasonable. And that protection was officially gone. The first crack didn't come from the courtroom. It came from inside the company. Elaine called me early Tuesday morning, her voice lower than usual, controlled, focused. "Something shifted overnight," she said. I sat up in bed. "What kind of shift?" "Their outside auditor resigned." I let that sink in. Auditors don't walk away quietly unless they've seen something they don't want attached to their name. "Do we know why?" I asked. Officially, she said, conflict of scope. Unofficially, they were asked to sign off on disclosures that didn't align with internal records. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but recognition. "This is about the logistics arm," I said. Elaine paused. "How did you know?" "Because that's where the numbers never quite matched," I replied. "I flagged it years ago. When Daniel first joined the company, he'd bragged about how complicated that division was. Multiple subsidiaries, overlapping contracts, revenue that moved just enough to confuse anyone who didn't know where to look. And I had known where to look. I just hadn't realized how much they were relying on me not to remember. By mid-morning, Elaine forwarded me a confidential memo leaked from inside the firm. No names, no commentary, just figures. Deferred liabilities, undisclosed guarantees, personal loans secured against corporate assets, and one line that made my breath catch. Executive personal exposure mitigated through family trust structure. There it was, the reason for everything. This wasn't just about inheritance or favoritism or even my grandmother's stake. They had used the trust to shield themselves from risk, from their own decisions. That's fraud, I said quietly. Elaine didn't contradict me. At minimum, it's misrepresentation. And now that the auditor stepped away, regulators will start asking why. My phone buzzed while we were still talking. Daniel. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Rebecca, you need to call me now. I waited until Elaine finished explaining the next steps before calling him back. He answered on the first ring. They're tearing the company apart, he said, panic bleeding through his voice. People are asking questions I can't answer. Then stop answering for them, I said. You don't understand, he snapped. They're saying this is your fault. I closed my eyes. Of course they are. They want me to sign something, he said. A statement, saying the restructuring was my idea. That was the moment. The one they had been building toward without realizing it. They're asking you to lie, I said. They're asking me to protect the family, he replied. No, I said firmly. They're asking you to take the fall. Silence. I didn't know it was like this, he said quietly. You knew enough, I replied. Now you know the rest. What happens if I don't sign, he asked. They lose their shield, I said. And you stop being useful. Another silence, longer this time. I'm scared, he admitted. I softened just slightly. So was I, when they decided I was expendable. That afternoon, Elaine received a formal notice. A whistleblower inquiry had been initiated. Anonymous, internal, specific. She forwarded it to me with a single line. This isn't from you, which means you're not alone. I felt something shift in my chest. I wasn't the only one who had been paying attention. By evening, my parents' attorneys requested an emergency call. Elaine took it without me. She summarized afterward. They want to contain damage, she said. They're offering to unwind certain trust provisions quietly. Quietly for whom, I asked. For regulators, she replied. And for Daniel. My phone rang again. Daniel. I answered this time. I didn't sign, he said immediately. I exhaled slowly. Good. They told me I was ungrateful, he continued, that I was betraying them. I leaned against the counter. Welcome to the part where loyalty only goes one way. They said if this goes public, everything collapses, he said. Not everything, I replied. Just the parts built on lies. He swallowed. What do I do? I chose my words carefully. You tell the truth, I said, and you stop letting them decide who absorbs the damage. The next morning, news broke quietly. Not headlines. Trade publications, regulatory notices, questions framed as routine. An inquiry into asset shielding practices. A review of trust-based liability mitigation. A request for documentation. My parents' name appeared once. So did the company's. At noon, Elaine called again. They're offering mediation, she said. Real mediation, with oversight. That's a retreat, I replied. Yes, she said, because now the risk isn't family conflict. It's exposure, I finished. Daniel came by that night, not angry, not defensive, tired. They always said you didn't need protection, he said softly. I think they meant you didn't need the truth. I met his eyes. And you believed them. He nodded. I won't anymore. When he left, I stood alone in the quiet apartment, understanding something with absolute clarity. The will had been the excuse. The trust had been the weapon. But the real crime was assuming I would stay small to keep their system intact. That assumption was gone. And now everything built on it was starting to fall. The investigation didn't announce itself with sirens or headlines. It arrived the way real consequences always do. Quietly. Methodically. Impossible to ignore once it was in motion. Elaine called me just after 7 the next morning. They opened a formal inquiry, she said. I sat at the edge of the bed, feet on the floor, fully awake. Federal. State regulators first, she replied. Financial Oversight Division. They're requesting documents tied to trust restructuring intercompany loans and personal guarantees. How long do they have, I asked. Not long, she said, and that's the point. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumph. I felt gravity. The kind that settles in when you realize events are no longer being steered by emotion or family pressure, but by systems that don't care who raised whom. By mid-morning, my parents' house was quiet. Daniel texted me. They took the files, all of them. I stared at the message. State investigators had arrived in person. They didn't knock for permission. They served notice. By noon, the family group chat lit up for the first time in weeks. Mom, we need to come together. Dad, this is being misunderstood. Aunt Lisa, this is what happens when family disputes go public. I left it unread. I went to work instead. There was something grounding about sitting at my desk answering emails, reviewing documents that were honest in their intent. No subtext, no manipulation, just clarity. At lunch, Elaine forwarded me a copy of the inquiry notice. It was devastating in its simplicity. Request for documentation demonstrating legitimate business purpose for trust-based asset shielding. Shielding. They hadn't even softened the language. They're not assuming guilt, Elaine said when I called her back. But they are assuming intent. And intent is where this collapses, I said. Yes, she replied. Because intent lives in emails, in drafts, in conversations people thought would never be read by anyone else. That afternoon, my mother finally showed up at my apartment. She stood in the hallway, coat still on, eyes red but dry, controlled. "We need to talk," she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't sit. She paced. "This has gone too far," she said. "We never imagined it would escalate like this." "I did," I replied calmly. She stopped pacing. "You wanted this." "No," I said. "I wanted transparency. This is what happens when people avoid it too long." She turned toward me, anger slipping through her composure. "You could have handled this privately." "I tried," I replied. "You didn't listen." Her voice cracked. "Your father could lose everything." I held her gaze. "Then he should have thought about that before he moved assets he didn't own." She stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. "This isn't about money anymore," she said quietly. I nodded. It never was. She sank onto the couch, then suddenly smaller. "They're asking questions we can't answer," she admitted. "About your grandmother, about Daniel, about why you weren't informed." I sat across from her. "Because the truth is inconvenient." Her shoulders slumped. "We were trying to protect the family. You were trying to control it," I said gently. "There's a difference." She covered her face with her hands. For the first time since this began, I felt something like sorrow. Not for what was happening, but for how predictable it had been. At 4, Daniel called. "They're interviewing employees," he said. "People I thought were loyal." "They're loyal to facts," I replied. "That's different." "They asked about you," he continued, "about your involvement before I joined." "And what did you say?" I asked. "I told them the truth," he said, "that you reviewed contracts, that you flagged risks, that you weren't paid." I closed my eyes. "Thank you," I said. There was a pause. I should have said it sooner. "Yes," I replied, "you should have." That evening, news finally surfaced. Not on television, not trending. A small article in a regional business journal. Regulators review family-owned firms' trust practices amid internal dispute. No names yet, but enough. Elaine texted me a single line. "This is the point of no return." I knew that already. That night alone in my apartment, I thought about the word revenge. How often people imagined it as something loud, violent, cruel. This wasn't that. This was consequence. I hadn't exposed them. I hadn't leaked anything. I hadn't spoken publicly. I had simply stopped absorbing the damage for them. And without that buffer, their system couldn't stand. My phone buzzed one last time before midnight. "Daniel, I don't know who we are without all of this." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. That's what happens when control replaces honesty. Eventually, there's nothing underneath. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the quiet. The investigation was moving. The truth was documented. The family was fractured. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. This wasn't revenge. It was release. The request arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped into my inbox between a routine work update and a calendar reminder. Subject: request for voluntary testimony. I stared at the words longer than I expected to. Voluntary meant I still had a choice. It also meant they already knew enough to ask. Elaine called me minutes later, as if she had felt the shift in the air. "They're asking you to go on record," she said. As a witness, I replied, "Yes," she said. "Not a target, not yet." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For weeks, everything had happened around me. Through documents, through other people's statements, through systems grinding forward without emotion. This was different. This required my voice. "What happens if I don't?" I asked. "They'll proceed without you," Elaine replied. "But your absence will leave room for interpretation." "And if I do?" I asked. "Then the narrative stops being flexible," she said, "for anyone." I didn't answer right away. At lunch, Daniel called. "They're talking about assigning blame," he said quietly, "inside the company." "Of course they are," I replied. "They're saying it was a misunderstanding," he continued, "that no one intended harm." I stirred my soup slowly. "Intent doesn't erase outcome." "They're also saying you pushed this too far," he added. I smiled faintly. "That's how accountability always feels to people who avoid it." He hesitated. "They asked me to emphasize your distance from operations." My hand stilled. "And did you?" I asked. "No," he said. "I told them the truth again." "That's all you can do," I replied. That evening, my father emailed me directly for the first time since the investigation began. Subject: please read. The message was long, careful, exhausted. He wrote about pressure, about mistakes made under stress, about how everything had grown bigger than anyone expected. He asked me not to testify. Not demanded, not threatened. Asked. For a moment, I felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to smooth things over, to absorb discomfort, to keep the family intact by staying quiet. Then I remembered the ledger, the power of attorney, my grandmother's letter, and how easily they had proceeded without me. I replied with a single sentence, "I will tell the truth." The interview was scheduled for the following Monday. Elaine prepared me carefully, but not theatrically. She didn't coach answers. She reminded me of one rule. "Don't explain more than you're asked," she said. "Clarity is stronger than emotion." The room was smaller than I expected. 2 investigators, neutral expressions, a recorder placed gently between us. They began with background questions, my relationship to the family, my role over the years, my understanding of the trust. Then they moved to the moment everything changed. "When did you first learn of the restructuring?" one of them asked. "After it was finalized," I replied. "Were you consulted?" the other asked. "No." "Were you informed he followed?" "No." They exchanged a look and continued. They asked about my grandmother. I described her clearly, her habits, her lucidity, the letters she wrote. They asked about the power of attorney. I answered precisely. They asked about my unpaid work for the company. I listed examples, dates, emails. They didn't interrupt. When it was over, one of them turned off the recorder and looked at me. "Thank you," he said. "This was helpful." "Helpful?" Outside, Elaine waited. "It's done," I said. "Yes," she replied, and it mattered. That afternoon, the tone shifted everywhere at once. Daniel texted. "They're changing strategy," Elaine called. "They're distancing themselves from the trust," she said. "Your parents, I mean." Quietly. My mother left a voicemail I didn't listen to. By evening, rumors circulated that my father was preparing to step back from operations, citing health and stress. A familiar maneuver. Exit before consequence fully arrives. Daniel came by that night. "They're trying to make this look like mismanagement," he said. "Not manipulation." "That's predictable," I replied. He looked at me, eyes tired. "Do you regret testifying?" I shook my head. "I regret waiting so long to stop protecting them." He nodded slowly. The next morning, Elaine forwarded me a draft summary from the investigators. Preliminary findings suggested misuse of fiduciary authority, inadequate disclosure, improper consolidation of assets under trust protections. It wasn't final, but it was enough. I stood by the window of my apartment watching traffic move steadily below and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because they were being held accountable, but because I no longer had to carry the weight of what they had done. The truth was no longer mine to manage. It belonged to the record now, and that changed everything. The findings were released on a Wednesday morning, quietly uploaded to a state website few people ever visited unless they were looking for trouble. Elaine sent me the link with a single message. "It's official." I opened the document slowly, not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I understood what it meant. Words on paper have weight when they can no longer be rewritten. The language was restrained, clinical, unemotional. Breach of fiduciary duty, improper use of power of attorney, failure to disclose material information to affected parties, trust restructuring used to limit personal liability. My father's name appeared 4 times. My mother's appeared twice. Daniel's appeared once, followed by the word cooperating. I closed the document and sat back in my chair staring at nothing. This was the moment everyone imagines when they think of revenge. The exposure, the reckoning, the proof. And yet what I felt wasn't satisfaction. It was finality. By noon, the call started. Not from family, from people who had once orbited them, a former business partner, an advisor who wanted to clarify past conversations, a distant cousin asking if I was okay. I answered none of them. Elaine called in the afternoon. "They're imposing penalties," she said. "Financial, operational, oversight." "And the trust?" I asked. "It's being unwound," she replied. "Certain provisions voided, assets reassigned pending review." Pending review meant months, possibly years, but the shield was gone. Daniel texted me shortly after. "Dad is stepping down. Mom isn't handling it well." I read the message without responding. At 4:30, my mother arrived at my apartment again. This time she didn't pace. She didn't argue. She sat. "They've taken everything," she said flatly. "No," I replied. "They've taken control." She looked up at me, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "You could have stopped this." I met her gaze calmly. I didn't start it. Silence stretched between us. "You always wanted independence," she said finally. "I never thought it would look like this." "I never wanted exclusion," I replied. "I just stopped accepting it." Her shoulders sagged. "Your father is lost." "That's not mine to fix," I said gently. She studied my face, searching for something. Mercy, guilt, permission. She found none. When she left, the apartment felt lighter. That evening, Daniel came by. "They're saying you destroyed the family," he said quietly. I leaned against the counter. "Families don't collapse because one person tells the truth." He nodded slowly. "I know." "They want you to step up," he added, "to stabilize things." "And what do you want?" I asked. He hesitated. "I don't know who I am without their expectations." "That's not a crisis," I said. "That's a beginning." He left not long after, shoulders hunched, carrying a future he'd never been allowed to choose. That night, I packed the last box of items tied to my parents' house. Old photographs, holiday cards, objects that held more obligation than memory. I didn't throw them away. I didn't keep them either. I set the box by the door. By Friday, the story had spread enough to lose its edge. The scandal softened into analysis, the outrage diluted into commentary. That's how these things always go. But inside my life, something had shifted permanently. I woke up Saturday morning without the weight of anticipation. No calls to brace for, no emotions to manage on behalf of others. Just quiet. I went for a long walk, letting the cold air sharpen my thoughts. The power they once held over me hadn't disappeared when the report was published. It disappeared the moment I stopped protecting their version of events. That was the real collapse. And it had nothing to do with documents. It had everything to do with consent. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. No dramatic apologies, no public reversals, no moment where everyone suddenly understood what they had done. What followed instead was distance measured in weeks without contact, in conversations that never happened, and invitations that were never extended again. That was how the family reconfigured itself. Not with a bang, but with absence. Elaine called me the following Monday to go over next steps. There were still procedural matters, asset reviews, compliance follow-ups, paperwork that would take months to fully resolve. "You're no longer required to participate," she said, "unless you choose to." "I don't," I replied. She didn't sound surprised. That's wise. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and stared at my calendar. For the first time in years, there were no reminders tied to someone else's expectations. No birthdays I felt obligated to remember more carefully than my own. No holidays that required strategic emotional management. The silence wasn't empty. It was spacious. Daniel called midweek. "I moved out," he said. "From where?" I asked. "From the house," he replied. "I needed distance." I considered that for a moment. "That's a start." "They're still angry," he said. "At you, at me, at everything." "That will pass," I replied. "Or it won't. Either way, it's not yours to manage." He sighed. "You sound lighter." "I am," I said. There was a pause. "Do you think we'll ever be close again?" The question carried years of imbalance. "I think we'll be honest," I replied. "If that leads to closeness, fine. If it doesn't, that's also fine." He didn't argue. That Friday, I received a final email from my father. No subject line. He wrote about regret without naming it, about fear without admitting responsibility, about how he believed he had done what was necessary, even if it cost him relationships he hadn't realized were fragile. He ended with one sentence: "I hope one day you understand." I read it twice, then closed my laptop. Understanding was never the problem. Acceptance had been. I didn't respond. That weekend, I boxed up the last of the things I had brought from my parents' house years earlier, not because they hurt to look at, but because they no longer belonged in the life I was building. I donated most of it: old furniture, extra kitchenware, objects that had followed me out of habit rather than meaning. What I kept fit into a single drawer. I slept better after that. Weeks passed. The regulatory process faded into the background hum of consequence. My parents withdrew from public-facing roles. The company stabilized under external oversight. Daniel remained employed, but no longer insulated. No one asked me to help. No one assumed I would. That was the clearest sign that something fundamental had changed. One evening, while cooking dinner, I caught my reflection in the darkened window and paused. I looked the same face, same posture. But the tension I had once mistaken for maturity was gone. In its place was something steadier. Ownership. Not of assets, not of legacy. Of myself. I thought about my grandmother then, about how she had always told me to read what people avoided explaining, to listen to what was left unsaid, to trust patterns over promises. She had been right. Not about money, about people. As autumn deepened, my life settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than assigned. Work that respected my boundaries, relationships that didn't require translation, even solitude that felt chosen, not imposed. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns fast. What remained was clarity. And clarity, I had learned, was the most lasting consequence of all. The last conversation happened without planning. No lawyers, no witnesses, no agenda. It was a Sunday afternoon in early winter when my phone rang with a number I hadn't saved but recognized immediately. My father. I considered letting it go to voicemail, not out of spite, out of habit. For weeks now, I had been choosing when to engage instead of reacting automatically. But something told me this was the end of the thread. I answered. "Rebecca," he said. His voice sounded thinner, stripped of the authority it once carried so effortlessly. "I won't keep you long." I stayed silent. "I'm calling because everything is settled," he continued. "The reviews, the oversight, the changes." "I know," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. "I keep thinking about where it went wrong," he said. "And I realize now, I never asked you what you wanted." The admission was small, too late to fix anything, but real. "I wanted honesty," I said, "from the beginning." "Yes," he replied quietly, "I see that now." He didn't apologize. Not directly, but he didn't justify himself either. That for him was as close as it would ever get. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just didn't want this to end with silence." I looked out the window as he spoke. The street below was calm, ordinary, life continuing without reference to our history. "It doesn't have to end with silence," I said, "but it can't continue the way it was." "I understand," he said, and for the first time I believed him. We hung up without ceremony. I didn't cry afterward. I didn't feel hollow. I felt complete. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table and wrote a letter I would never send. Not to my parents, not to Daniel. To myself. I wrote down the things I had learned not as lessons, but as truths earned through experience. That being reasonable is not the same as being respected. That silence is not peace when it's demanded. That family loyalty should never require self-erasure. That inheritance is not just money but power, and power reveals character. That walking away is not betrayal when staying requires dishonesty. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it in the drawer with the few things I had kept. That was enough. In the months that followed, my life expanded in quiet, meaningful ways. I built routines that belonged to me. I formed relationships that didn't rely on imbalance. I learned to recognize the moment when a line needed to be drawn and to draw it without apology. People sometimes ask me if I regret how everything unfolded. I don't. Not because it was easy, not because it was painless, but because it was honest. I didn't take revenge. I didn't seek punishment. I didn't destroy anyone. I simply stopped participating in a system that required my silence to survive. And once I did that, the truth took care of the rest. If you're listening to this story and seeing pieces of your own life in it, hear this clearly. You are not selfish for asking questions. You are not difficult for demanding transparency. You are not wrong for stepping back when decisions are made without you. Sometimes the most powerful act is not confrontation. It's withdrawal. Not running away, but standing still while others reveal who they are. I didn't win an inheritance. I didn't gain control of a business. I didn't get a dramatic apology. What I gained was something far more valuable. My name, my voice, my place in my own life. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been made to feel invisible in your own family, your own marriage, or your own workplace, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let others know what you recognized. And if you want more stories about truth, consequences, and dignity reclaimed, subscribe to the channel. Because the things people hide don't stay hidden forever. And the truth, when you finally stop protecting others from it, has a way of setting you free.